In today's class, we will be talking about how the French changed the education system for the Vietnamese. Let us take a look at the topics that we will be discussing in today's class. Why couldn't most of the Vietnamese obtain an education? What was taught in these French schools? What was a Western-style education? Well, there was a very small part of Vietnamese population who could afford to send their kids to a school. These people belonged to the elite section and were very less in number. Now, can you imagine, even out of this small fraction, there were very few who could actually pass the school leaving examination? I'll give you a rough idea of how less this number was. In 1925, out of a population of 17 million, less than 400 students passed. Why was it that such fewer students passed? Was it because they were not able to study, or was it some other reason? Well, this was because of a deliberate policy which the French followed, where students were failed in the final year so that they were not qualified enough for better paid jobs. We know that a very less number of students were passing out of schools, but what exactly was taught in these schools? As these schools were introduced by the French, they justified the colonial rule. The school textbooks were made as such that they glorified the French and portrayed Vietnamese as backward. These schools taught the students that Vietnamese were only capable of manual labor and they could not perform tasks that included intellect. They were labeled as skilled copyists and could not be creative. The students were made to understand that only under the French rule could Vietnam be in peace. This kind of education, which promoted the French, was known as Western-style education. Now let us understand this type of education in more detail. In 1907, the French started the Tonkin Free School to provide the Vietnamese with a Western-style education. This school included subjects like science, hygiene, and French. As we have discussed earlier, there were very few Vietnamese who were enrolled in schools, and to learn French, they had to pay separately. The school taught the students to be modern, as the French thought it was their duty to modernize Vietnam. What was it to be modern according to the French? Just learning the subjects, and the Western styles were not enough. The Vietnamese also had to look modern. Now, as Vietnamese followed Chinese culture, where long hair was a tradition, the French wanted them to have shorter hair, which was a major break with their own identity. This was all about what did the French schools taught the Vietnamese and how it affected their lifestyle. Now let us take a short recap of today. The Vietnamese elite were the only ones who could enroll their kids in school, which was a very small population. A fewer amount of people were only able to clear the final level examination due to a deliberate policy of the French, where students were failed so that they could not get better paid jobs. The French schools only glorified the colonial rule, and the school textbooks taught students that Vietnamese were only capable of manual labor and they could not perform tasks that included intellect. This kind of education, which promoted the French, was known as Western-style education. In 1907, the French started the Tonkin Free School to provide the Vietnamese with a Western-style education. The French wanted to promote modern ideas and not only wanted them to think modern, but also look modern. So they asked the Vietnamese students to cut their hair to look modern.